A struggling single dad buys a broken $200 car while everyone around him laughs, especially the woman who thinks he just made the dumbest mistake of his life. But over the next few days, a hidden truth begins to surface, and what looked like worthless scrap turns into something far bigger than anyone imagined. This is a story about quiet dignity, buried history, unexpected love, and a moment that changes everything. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? 5 days earlier, Nolan Pierce had exactly $246 left in his checking account. He knew the number because he had checked it twice in the parking lot before walking into Redstone Estate Auctions with his 8-year-old daughter, Maisie, asleep against his shoulder. The auction hall smelled like wet concrete, burnt coffee, and old rubber. Outside, rain ticked against the metal roof in a steady, tired rhythm. He had not come looking for a miracle. Men like Nolan stopped expecting miracles somewhere between overdue rent, school pickup, and the quiet shame of saying, maybe next month, whenever a child wanted something small. He had come looking for a bargain, something he could fix, something he could flip, something that might buy him a little more room to breathe. Since his wife had died 3 years earlier, breathing room had become its own kind of luxury. Maisie stirred as he shifted her gently and lowered her onto a folding chair near the back. He tucked his jacket around her and brushed the hair away from her face. That small motion, practiced, gentle, automatic, was the one thing in his life that still felt certain. The auction rolled through damaged pickups, repossessed vans, and one ugly speedboat no one wanted. Nolan watched with half his attention until Lot 73 was pushed into view. At first glance, it looked like a bad decision on wheels. A low, battered coupe body, faded silver paint under dust and oxidation, missing grille, one headlamp cracked, interior stripped almost bare. The tires were ancient. The front quarter panel wore a scar of old bad bodywork, and the whole thing sat with the sad posture of something that had been forgotten on purpose. A few people laughed under their breath. Nolan didn't. He stepped closer. The lines were wrong for a throwaway car. Too deliberate, too balanced. The front arches had been shaped by hand, not stamped in bulk. The welds near the engine bay were old, clean, almost elegant. Even under grime, it had presence. "Cute, isn't it?" a woman said beside him. Her voice had that polished kind of sharpness some people used instead of raising it. Nolan turned. She was in a camel coat and narrow heels that had no business being in an auction yard. Her name tag read, Felicity Crane, Consignment Director. Her smile was neat and expensive and didn't reach her eyes. "Cute's one word for it," Nolan said. She gave the car a quick glance. "We thought about sending it straight to scrap, but apparently somebody believed in second chances." Nolan rested a hand lightly on the roofline. Maybe they were right. That made her look at him properly. Then her gaze dropped to his worn boots, his frayed cuff, the sleeping child behind him. "You're serious?" she asked. He met her eyes. "About what?" "Buying this." She let out a tiny laugh, just enough for the man beside her to hear. "It'll cost more to tow home than it's worth." It was not a cruel scene, not loud, not theatrical. That almost made it worse. Nolan felt the heat rise in his neck. Not because of himself. He had been underestimated before. He could survive that. But Maisie had heard the tone. Children always heard the tone. When he turned, she was awake now, small fingers clutching his jacket, watching the adults with that quiet alertness kids learned too early. Nolan crouched beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, then glanced at the car. "Are we still looking?" He smiled softly. "Yeah, we're still looking." A few feet away, another woman had been photographing the lot numbers and details into a tablet. She was wearing a navy rain jacket, dark curls pinned loosely back, no performance in her face at all. Just focus. She looked from the car to Nolan, then to the hand-formed seam along the doorframe. Her expression changed, not excitement. Recognition. She walked over slowly. "Sorry," she said, addressing Nolan, not Felicity. Can I see the inner dash plate, if it's still there? Felicity folded her arms. Ada, it's junk. The woman ignored her. Nolan studied her a second, then pulled the driver door wider. Be my guest. She leaned inside, careful, like the car might still have dignity left in it. Her fingers brushed away dust near the firewall, her brows knit. What is it? Nolan asked. She looked back at him. I'm not sure yet. That answer should have ended there. But it didn't, because in her voice, Nolan heard something he had not heard all week. Possibility. The bidding started low, lower than low, really. The room had already decided the car was a joke. Nolan lifted his paddle once. No one challenged him. The hammer fell so fast it almost felt accidental. $200. As people drifted on to the next lot, Felicity gave him one last thin smile. Well, congratulations. Nolan didn't answer. He was too busy watching Ada Bennett kneel by the front wheel, staring at an old riveted panel hidden behind years of grime. When she rose, she handed him her card. Ada Bennett, Automotive Archive Consultant. On the back, she had written one sentence. Don't clean the stamp near the firewall until I see it in proper light. Nolan looked from the card to the car, then to Ada. Why? He asked. She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then she said, because I think you may have just bought something people weren't meant to overlook. Nolan did not sleep much that night. The car sat under the weak security light outside his rented duplex, rainwater drying in faint silver tracks along the ruined bodywork. Every time he looked out the kitchen window, it seemed to change shape. In the auction yard, it had looked tired. Here, in the dark, it looked like it was waiting. Maisie ate cereal at the counter the next morning, swinging one foot and watching him pretend not to be distracted. Is it special? She asked. He rinsed out his mug. Maybe. She narrowed her eyes in the serious way only children could. That means yes. He smiled despite himself. That means I don't know yet. At 9:12, Ada Bennett texted him. Can I stop by? Bring daylight, coffee, and bad news if necessary. He stared at the message longer than he should have. Then he wrote back. Coffee I can manage. Bad news. Maybe less welcome. She arrived 20 minutes later in an old dark green wagon with cracked leather seats and a camera case in the back. No polished performance, no expensive entrance. Just a tired woman with clear eyes and a stack of reference folders on the passenger seat. Maisie peered from the doorway while Nolan walked Ada around to the car. Up close, Ada became even more careful with it. She crouched by the front end, checked the welds, photographed the dash plate, then slid a light across the stamped area near the firewall Nolan had left untouched. For almost a full minute, she said nothing. Nolan tried not to crowd her. That bad? It's the opposite of bad. She stood slowly. And that's the problem. He folded his arms. Talk to me. Ada looked at the car, not him. In the late 90s, Hastings Motor Works built 3 experimental road racing prototypes, not official production models, test cars, mules. They used them to trial weight balance, suspension geometry, and aero changes before a short-lived endurance program. Nolan knew the name Hastings. Everyone did, if they cared at all about motorsport history. What happened to them? He asked. One was destroyed in testing. One went to a private collection in Switzerland. She touched the roofline lightly. The third one vanished after an ownership dispute when Hastings folded the program. He followed her gaze back to the battered shell. You think this is that car? I think this is the body shell of that car, she said carefully. Maybe more. But if I'm right, it was disguised later. Retagged, stripped, buried under repairs so no one would ask questions. Nolan let that settle. Then he laughed once under his breath, not because it was funny, but because his life did not usually leave room for sentences like that. Maisie had stepped outside without either of them noticing. She looked up at Ada. So we saved it? Ada's whole face softened. Yeah, she said gently. I think maybe you did. That landed harder than Nolan expected. By noon, the three of them were in Nolan's garage, with the side door open to the spring air. Ada moved through the space like she belonged in practical places. She didn't flinch at grease or mess or the stacked school lunch containers drying by the sink. She simply rolled up her sleeves and kept working. Nolan noticed small things. The way she tucked loose curls behind one ear when she concentrated, the tiny scar near her wrist, the fact that she spoke to Maisie like a person, not a child-shaped interruption. At one point, while Nolan loosened a corroded panel fastener, Ada leaned in close to steady the light. Their shoulders touched for half a second. Nothing dramatic happened. No music in the air. No movie pause. But Nolan felt it anyway, the quiet, inconvenient awareness of another adult who saw the mess of his life and did not step back from it. He straightened too quickly. Sorry. Ada looked at him, then smiled a little. You keep apologizing for existing in your own garage. He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Bad habit. Maybe retire it. The problem with warmth, Nolan thought, was how fast it made you remember loneliness. By late afternoon, Ada had found enough details to stop guessing. Hidden beneath a replacement bracket was an original fabrication number. The steering geometry matched archived engineering notes she pulled up on her tablet. Most convincing of all was a handwritten mark, half buried under primer, from a Hastings test engineer long dead. Ada went still when she saw it. This is it, she said. Nolan stared at her. You're sure? She nodded once. I'm sure enough to be nervous. That word changed everything. Not excited. Nervous. She explained why on the drive to a specialist storage unit outside town, where she wanted the car photographed properly before word spread. If this really was the missing Hastings mule, then collectors would come first, then lawyers, then people who suddenly remembered they had always cared about provenance. Meaning? Nolan asked from behind the wheel. Meaning the car just became important to people with money, Ada said. And important things attract pressure. He glanced at her. You sound like that's personal. For a moment, she looked out the window instead of answering. Then she said, my father spent his whole life around famous drivers and wealthy owners. He taught me that history brings out the best in some people. She paused. And ownership brings out the rest. That was the first time Nolan heard the fracture under her calm voice. Before he could ask more, his phone lit up on the console. Unknown number. Then another call. Then another. A message followed a minute later from Felicity Crane. I think you may have misunderstood what you purchased. We need to speak immediately. Nolan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Ada read the message over his shoulder, and the color left her face. Because a second text came in right after it. This one had no name. Just a photo. His duplex. His driveway. Maisie's bedroom window visible from the street. And beneath it, 6 words. Don't make this harder than necessary. Nolan pulled over before the edge of town. For one suspended second, all he could hear was the tick of the engine cooling and Maisie humming softly in the back seat, unaware that anything had changed. Ada looked at the photo again, jaw tight. This isn't random. No, Nolan said. It isn't. The old version of him, the one shaped by panic, bills, and too many nights solving problems alone, wanted to drive straight home and confront whoever had sent it. But Maisie was in the back seat. That changed the math. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, the retired nurse who had watched Maisie more than once when shifts ran late and life went sideways. 10 minutes later, Nolan dropped Maisie there with a calm face and a lie gentle enough to pass as ordinary. Grown-up paperwork, he told her, kneeling by the porch steps. I'll get pizza after. She studied him for a long moment, then touched his sleeve. You look like when you're trying not to worry. That almost broke him. I know, he said softly, but I'm okay. When he stood, Ada was already making a call of her own. Not to the police. To Victor Sloan. Nolan knew the name, of course. Anybody who had ever worked on cars with reverence knew it. Victor had been one of the last true endurance drivers of his era, fast, disciplined, famously private. The kind of man whose opinions could move markets without him trying. He drove for Hastings once, Ada said after she hung up, and he trusted my father. Nolan glanced at her. Your father worked for them? She nodded. He wasn't an executive. He was the archivist. the one who kept track of what the company wanted forgotten. She looked down at her hands. He found proof that the mule was being hidden during the collapse. He tried to report it. Nobody listened until it was too late. It clicked then, her caution, her nerves, the way she had touched the car like it belonged to memory before money. "This matters to you," Nolan said. Ada gave him a tired, honest look. More than it should. Victor asked them to meet at a restoration warehouse on the edge of Manchester neutral ground, privately owned, cameras everywhere. By the time Nolan and Ada rolled the battered Hastings shell inside, 2 legal advisors were already there, along with a historian Victor had brought to confirm the fabrication marks independently. Then Felicity arrived. Not in heels this time. Not polished. Just tense. For the first time, Nolan saw something under her sharpness that looked less like arrogance and more like fear. "You should have returned my calls," she said, but even she seemed to know the line had no weight left. Victor Sloan stood by the car with one hand on the roof, silent until everyone had settled. Age had narrowed him, not softened him. He carried himself like a man who had spent a lifetime learning that calm could control a room better than force. When he finally spoke, it was to the car itself, almost. "I watched this chassis being tested in winter rain," he said quietly. 12 laps, unstable on entry, brilliant on exit. Nobody interrupted. The historian confirmed the stamp, the fabrication number, the hidden engineering notation beneath primer. Every piece matched. It was real. The lost Hastings mule. Felicity sat down slowly, as if her knees had stopped trusting her. Victor turned to her, not unkindly. "Did you know?" Her eyes flickered to Nolan, then away. "Not fully." She swallowed. "I suspected it was unusual. The seller needed fast money. My company needed commission. I told myself it was probably nothing." Her voice thinned. Then when Ada showed interest, I knew it wasn't nothing. "So you sent the message," Ada said. Felicity's silence answered for her. Nolan expected anger to hit him harder than it did. Instead, he just felt tired. Tired in the deep way that came from being one more ordinary person caught in the orbit of people who thought pressure counted as strategy. Victor looked between them all, then made the only offer in the room that sounded like dignity. He did not want the car for a private vault. He wanted it restored, documented, and placed on permanent display at the Hastings Motor Heritage Trust, where students and engineers could study it publicly, properly, with Nolan named in the recovery record and Ada heading the historical certification. "And him?" Nolan asked, nodding toward the shell. Victor's eyes shifted back to the car. "If he agrees, I'd like him on the restoration team. Anyone who saw value in this when it looked like scrap has the right instincts." Nolan blinked. "I'm a mechanic, not a museum piece." Victor's mouth moved into the faintest smile. "Exactly." The financial terms were more than Nolan had ever seen on one page, but the thing that hit him hardest was not the number. It was the structure. A secured future. Education funds for Maisie. A salary, not a handout. Work he could respect. No one clapped. No one gasped. No one was humiliated for sport. Felicity apologized before she left. It was imperfect and late, but it was real enough to sound uncomfortable. Nolan accepted it with a nod and nothing more. Some endings did not need a speech. 3 weeks later, the first stage of restoration began. On the evening Nolan signed the final papers, he came home to find Ada in his garage, sleeves rolled up, labeling photographed parts, while Maisie sat on a stool nearby, drawing the car as if it were a superhero. "You let yourself in?" Nolan asked. Ada looked up. "Your daughter said I was expected." Maisie grinned. "You were taking too long." Nolan laughed, a real one this time. The garage door was open to a pale gold sunset. Tools lay in neat rows. The old silver shell rested under soft work lights, no longer abandoned, not yet finished. Ada stepped closer, grease faint on her wrist, warmth steady in her eyes. "So?" she said. "Still apologizing for existing in your own garage?" He looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. "Trying something new." "What's that?" Nolan glanced at Maisie, at the car, at the woman who had walked into a bad week and somehow left his life larger than she found it. Believing I'm allowed to keep good things, he said. Ada smiled at that small, quiet, certain. Then she reached for his hand. And this time, he didn't pull away.